What happens when a ruthless gang thinks they can harass and rob a lone black woman in broad daylight, only to discover she's a Navy SEAL with nothing to lose? Watch as she fights back, hunts them down one by one, and exposes a system of indifference and unchecked prejudice that's allowed men like them to terrorize for too long. Nia Taylor adjusted the strap of her gym bag as she strode down the crowded urban street, her posture straight and confident. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the bustling city, but she barely noticed. The rhythmic tap of her sneakers on the pavement and the weight of her bag were grounding, remnants of the intense workout she had just completed. Her life as a Navy SEAL had trained her to see everything and react to nothing, unless it mattered. That discipline now carried her through civilian life, where most threats were far less direct but no less irritating. She carried herself with an air of quiet authority, her sharp eyes briefly scanning her surroundings before focusing on the path ahead. Across the street, Greg Thompson leaned against a graffitied wall, laughing loudly with his friends, Paul and Ryan. The three of them stood out, their voices brash and grating. Greg's gaze landed on Nia as she passed, his laughter pausing for a brief moment. "Yo, check her out," he said, elbowing Paul. "Now that's something worth looking at." Paul grinned, his eyes following Greg's. "Yeah, walking around here like she's too good for the rest of us." Ryan snickered nervously, his gaze darting between Nia and Greg. "Bet she's one of those high-class types. Thinks she's untouchable." Nia didn't break stride, her gaze fixed ahead. The sharp, mocking tone in their voices didn't faze her. It was background noise she had learned to tune out long ago. "She's not even gonna look over here," Greg said, his smirk widening as he stepped off the wall. "Maybe we should teach her some manners." Nia caught the shift in his posture out of the corner of her eye, but kept moving. Her body language didn't betray a flicker of hesitation, but her mind was already tracking their positions, their voices, and the subtle rise in their aggression. "Hey, sweetheart," Greg called out, his voice louder now. "You in a hurry? We're just trying to be friendly." Nia kept her pace steady, her eyes narrowing slightly. Their taunts continued to rise behind her, echoing off the surrounding buildings, but she showed no sign of reacting. "Aw, come on," Paul jeered. "You don't even have the decency to say hello? That's just rude." Behind her, their laughter grew, and she knew this wasn't going to end with them staying where they were. Greg, Paul, and Ryan trailed behind Nia now, their voices carrying down the busy street. Their jeers blended with the background noise of honking cars and chattering pedestrians, but Nia's sharp ears caught every word. "Hey, don't be shy," Greg called, his tone mockingly sweet. "We're just trying to have a conversation. Isn't that what polite people do?" "She's got her nose in the air like she's royalty or something," Paul added, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think you're too good for us, huh?" Ryan chimed in, his voice lighter, but no less irritating. "Bet she's one of those types, all stuck up and acting like she's better than everyone." Nia's pace remained steady, her body language calm. She wasn't about to let their words pull her into a reaction, but their voices grew louder, their footsteps quicker, as they closed the distance. Greg moved closer, just enough to make his presence unavoidable. "You're not even gonna say thank you? We're giving you all this attention. Most people would kill for that." Nia's expression didn't change, but she subtly shifted her stance, distributing her weight evenly. "I didn't ask for it," she said, her tone quiet but cutting. Greg's grin widened, a dangerous glint in his eye. "Oh, she's got some fire," he said, gesturing to his friends. "Look at that. Finally got her to talk." "Come on, sweetheart," Paul said, stepping in closer from the side. "No need to be rude. We're just saying you look nice. Don't act like you don't love it." Ryan, emboldened by their words, spoke up again. "Yeah, we're just trying to get to know you. Why you gotta be like that?" Nia stopped in her tracks, forcing them to halt abruptly. Her head turned slightly, and she glanced over her shoulder, her sharp gaze sweeping over all three of them. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she said, her voice level and cold. "But here's some advice. Back off before you regret it." For a moment, Their confidence wavered. But Greg recovered quickly, his grin twisting into something darker. "Oh, we're the ones who'll regret it," he mocked. "That's cute." "Yeah," Paul added, his laughter rough. "Big talk for someone all alone." Greg leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. "Thing is, we don't back off, sweetheart. Maybe you need someone to show you how the world really works." The block ended with Greg stepping into her path, forcing her to stop as Paul and Ryan closed in on either side. Their arrogance was palpable, their voices filled with cruel amusement as they set the stage for their next move. Greg planted himself firmly in Nia's path, his smirk now fully twisted into something cruel. Paul and Ryan hovered on either side, their expressions dripping with entitlement and malice. "See, this is what's wrong with people like you," Greg said, his tone laced with venom. "Walking around like you own the place, like everyone else is beneath you." Nia's eyes narrowed slightly, her calm facade unshaken. "People like me?" she repeated, her voice cold and measured. "Yeah, you know what I mean," Greg sneered, stepping closer. "Think you can do whatever you want just because the world feels sorry for you." Paul laughed harshly, chiming in, "Bet you were raised to act like you're better than everyone." "Typical." Ryan, emboldened by the escalating tension, added, "What, you think you're some kind of queen? Walking around here like you're untouchable?" Nia's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, her sharp gaze moving between them. Greg wasn't finished. "Bet you're the kind who screams racist anytime someone looks at you wrong. Let me guess. You'd call the cops if we even said boo, wouldn't you?" "Yeah," Paul added, his voice dripping with mockery. "Run and cry for help. Isn't that what you people always do?" Nia's eyes flashed, but her voice remained steady. "The only people crying for help are the ones who don't know when to stop," she said, her tone like steel. Greg's smirk widened, his arrogance only growing. "Oh, you think you're tough? Think you can handle this on your own? You're all the same. Act all strong, but you break the second someone pushes back." Paul nudged Ryan, laughing. "She probably thinks she's too good to be scared of us." Ryan's voice faltered slightly, his earlier bravado wavering. "Maybe we should just—" "Shut up," Greg snapped, cutting him off. His attention snapped back to Nia, his grin twisting. "You know what? Let's see how tough you really are. Why don't you hand over that bag? Maybe then you'll learn a little respect." Nia didn't flinch, her body still and controlled. "You're making a mistake," she said evenly. Greg chuckled darkly, stepping closer as Paul and Ryan mirrored his movements. "No, sweetheart. The mistake was thinking you could walk past us like you're better than we are." Without warning, Greg lunged for the strap of her bag, his fingers outstretched as Paul moved in from the side. Greg's hand shot toward the strap of Nia's bag, but she reacted instantly, her arm snapping out to slap his hand away with a sharp, practiced motion. He stumbled back, his face twisting with anger and disbelief. "What the hell?" Greg barked, flexing his stinging hand. Nia didn't waste time responding. She shifted her stance, her mind already assessing her options. Staying would risk escalation, and she had no intention of letting this situation spiral out of control in such a public space. Paul moved toward her next, his movements clumsy and impatient. She sidestepped him with precision, her balance never wavering, before breaking into a sprint down the crowded street. "She's running!" Ryan shouted, his voice high-pitched and panicked. "After her!" Greg snapped, pushing Paul forward as he followed. Nia's feet pounded against the pavement, her breath controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The crowd parted as she moved, her sharp focus locking on potential exits. The voices of the men grew louder behind her, their footsteps hammering the ground in pursuit. "Where you gonna go, huh?" Greg yelled, his voice filled with mocking rage. "You can't run forever!" Paul's taunts followed close behind. "Come on, lady. Stop making this worse for yourself." Nia turned sharply down a side alley, using the narrow space to her advantage. The walls seemed to close in, forcing her pursuers into a single-file line. She pushed forward, her seal instincts kicking in as she scanned her surroundings for a plan. "She's fast!" Ryan wheezed, falling behind slightly. "She's cornered," Greg snarled. "She just doesn't know it yet." Ahead, a chain-link fence blocked the alley. Nia's eyes flicked to it briefly before she adjusted course, veering into another smaller alley. This one was a dead end, walled off by crumbling brick and surrounded by dumpsters and debris. Nia stopped, turning to face the way she had come. Her breath remained steady, her sharp eyes scanning the alley's entrance as Greg appeared first, his grin wide and triumphant. "Nowhere left to run, sweetheart," he said, stepping forward, his voice low and menacing. Paul followed closely, his expression smug. "Guess all that running didn't do you any good, huh?" Ryan lingered at the back, his grin less certain but still present. "Told you we'd get her." Nia stood tall, her posture steady, her eyes locked on Greg. "You boys don't know what you've just walked into," she said evenly, her voice calm but chilling. Greg laughed harshly, his bravado undimmed. "We walked into you being done. You've got nothing now." Paul cracked his knuckles, inching closer. Time to teach her some respect. Nia shifted her stance slightly, her muscles coiled, ready for what was coming. The tension in the air was electric as the men closed in, their arrogance blinding them to the calm power radiating from her. Greg made the first move, lunging at Nia with his hands outstretched, aiming to grab her. She sidestepped smoothly, her movements quick and deliberate, causing him to stumble forward. As he turned to face her, her knee shot up, driving into his side with precision. He grunted in pain, staggering back a step, but his face twisted into a mask of determination. "You've got some nerve," he spat, clutching his ribs as he regained his footing. Paul wasted no time, stepping in with wide, clumsy swings of his fists. Nia ducked the first punch and stepped inside his reach, delivering a sharp elbow strike to his ribs. He gasped, doubling over, but before she could press the advantage, Greg surged forward again, his shoulders slamming into her from behind. The impact pushed her forward a step, and she braced herself, twisting to break free of his hold. As Greg's arm reached for her, she drove her elbow back into his jaw, forcing him to stumble to the side. Paul recovered quickly, his movements fueled by frustration. He came at her again, throwing another wild punch. This time, his fist grazed her cheek, but she moved with the blow, minimizing the impact. Nia retaliated with a quick jab to his midsection, following it up with a kick to his shin that forced him to retreat. Ryan hovered on the edge of the scuffle, his movements hesitant. His eyes darted between Greg and Paul, as if unsure whether to join the fray. "What are you waiting for?" Greg barked, steadying himself against the wall. "Get in there!" Spurred on by the command, Ryan stepped forward, his nervous energy driving him into a clumsy rush. Nia turned to meet him, her hand shooting out to intercept his arm mid-swing. She twisted sharply, forcing him to cry out in pain as she bent his wrist at an awkward angle. With a quick motion, she kicked at his knee, sending him sprawling to the ground. Greg, now furious, charged again, his hands aiming to grab hold of her. Nia prepared for the impact, stepping into his momentum and using his weight against him. She twisted, sending him crashing into one of the alley's dumpsters with a loud metallic thud. Paul took advantage of the brief opening, managing to land a hit to her side. The punch sent a dull ache through her ribs, but it only sharpened her focus. She turned quickly, grabbing his arm and yanking him forward. Paul stumbled, and Nia drove her knee into his stomach, forcing the air from his lungs. Ryan scrambled back to his feet, visibly shaking but unwilling to retreat entirely. He glanced nervously at Greg, who was already pulling himself upright, a smear of dirt on his face. "You're not walking out of here," Greg growled, his voice hard and steady. He wiped his face with his sleeve and squared his shoulders, his determination unwavering. Paul, clutching his side, nodded grimly. "She can't take all three of us at once." Greg motioned to both of them, his eyes locked on Nia. Together this time. Nia's breathing remained steady, her eyes sharp as she assessed the men. They were battered but still dangerous, their arrogance blinding them to how outmatched they truly were. As they began to close in again, circling her like wolves, She shifted her stance, her muscles coiling in preparation. Greg charged first, his movements wild and uncoordinated. Nia stood her ground, waiting until the last second before stepping to the side and sweeping her leg out. Greg's momentum carried him forward, and he crashed to the ground, his hands slapping the pavement as he scrambled to recover. Paul came next, swinging his fists in rapid but aimless strikes. Nia ducked under one punch and sidestepped another, her movements precise and fluid. She stepped forward, delivering a sharp elbow to his ribs. Paul staggered back, gasping, his arms flailing to maintain balance. Ryan hesitated, his eyes darting between his companions and Nia. But Greg's bark cut through the tension. "Get in there, Ryan! Now!" Ryan moved forward reluctantly, his motions clumsy and half-hearted. Nia deflected his attempt to grab her arm and countered with a sharp kick to the back of his knee. Ryan cried out as he collapsed, clutching his leg as he hit the ground. Greg, now furious, snatched a loose piece of wood from the alley floor and charged at her. Nia's sharp eyes caught the weapon in his hand, and she stepped back, letting him overcommit to the swing. As the wood arced through the air, she darted forward, grabbing it mid-swing and yanking it from his grasp. With a quick motion, she tossed it aside, leaving Greg momentarily stunned. "You think this is funny?" Greg growled, his face twisting with rage. Nia's response was swift and silent. She drove her knee into his stomach, forcing the air from his lungs and sending him crumpling to the ground. Paul, emboldened by desperation, tried one last charge. Nia sidestepped his wild swing and struck him in the back of the knee, sending him sprawling onto the pavement next to Greg. Ryan scrambled to his feet, his face pale. "This isn't worth it, Greg! Let's just go!" Greg groaned as he pushed himself up onto one knee, his face red with anger and humiliation. "Fine!" he spat. "Let's get out of here." Paul nodded weakly, following Ryan's lead as they stumbled toward the alley's exit. Greg lingered for a moment, his eyes locking with Nia's. "You're gonna regret this," he growled before limping after the others. Nia watched them retreat, her breathing controlled as she stood tall. But as the adrenaline coursing through her veins began to settle, a new resolve took hold. Letting them walk away felt wrong. These weren't the kind of men who would reflect or learn. They were the kind who would find another victim. Her jaw tightened as she adjusted the strap of her gym bag. "Not this time," she muttered under her breath. Without hesitation, Nia broke into a sprint, her sharp gaze locking on the trio as they disappeared into the crowd. The hunt wasn't over. Not yet. Her footsteps were swift and deliberate, weaving through the throng of pedestrians who instinctively stepped aside as she approached. Up ahead, Greg, Paul, and Ryan moved in a disorganized rush, their earlier confidence replaced with a frantic urgency. They pushed through the crowd, drawing annoyed glances and muttered complaints from bystanders. "She's still coming!" Ryan shouted, glancing over his shoulder. His face was pale, his breath ragged. "Keep moving!" Greg barked, his tone sharp with irritation. "Don't look back." But Ryan couldn't help himself. His eyes darted toward Nia again, and what he saw made him stumble. She was gaining on them, her strides steady, her expression unreadable but unmistakably focused. Paul grabbed Ryan's arm, yanking him forward. "Stop slowing down, man! Do you want her to catch us?" Nia stayed silent, her breathing controlled despite the exertion. Every movement was precise, calculated to conserve energy as she closed the distance. Her SEAL training guided her instincts, analyzing their patterns and searching for opportunities to narrow the gap. The trio turned sharply down a side street, their movements increasingly erratic. Nia followed without hesitation, her sharp eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. This area was quieter, the bustling crowd replaced with parked cars and scattered debris. The echo of their footsteps reverberated through the narrow space. Greg slowed briefly, his head whipping around to assess their pursuer. His jaw tightened when he saw her still behind them, relentless as ever. "She's not stopping," he muttered, his frustration mounting. "Let's split up," Paul suggested, his voice frantic. "She can't follow all of us." Greg shot him a glare. "No, we stick together. She's just one person." Ryan, trailing slightly behind, groaned. "She's one person who just took us all down." Greg ignored him, leading them into a narrower alley, its walls lined with dumpsters and old graffiti. He gestured for them to keep moving, his steps more deliberate now as he scanned for a potential escape route. Nia paused briefly at the entrance of the alley, assessing the terrain. Her lips pressed into a thin line. They were cornering themselves without even realizing it. As she moved forward, her sharp voice cut through the air. "You're only making this worse for yourselves. Stop running, and face me now." Her words echoed in the narrow space, sending a ripple of unease through the group. Ryan faltered, his pace slowing. "Don't listen to her," Greg snapped, his voice tight. "Keep moving!" Nia picked up speed, her footsteps growing louder as she closed the gap. They were running out of places to go, and she wasn't letting them slip away this time. The narrow alley opened into a cluttered back lot, its uneven pavement littered with broken pallets and discarded crates. Greg led the way, his movements more frantic now as he searched for an exit. Paul and Ryan followed closely, their breaths ragged from the relentless chase. "She's too close," Ryan panted, his voice cracking with panic. "We need to split up." "I said no," Greg snapped, his tone sharp. "We stick together. She's not catching us." "She's already beaten us once," Ryan muttered under his breath, though he didn't dare say it loud enough for Greg to hear. Behind them, Nia slowed her pace as she entered the lot. Her sharp eyes took in the surroundings, the uneven ground, the scattered debris, and the trio's stumbling movements ahead. She wasn't rushing. Her every step was calculated, her focus locked on their faltering retreat. Greg spotted a break in the fence at the far end of the lot. "There! Go!" he shouted, pushing Paul forward. Ryan trailed farther behind, his steps faltering as exhaustion overtook him. His foot caught on a loose board, and he went down hard, his knees hitting the pavement with a loud thud. "Get up!" Paul yelled, his voice tinged with panic. "I can't," Ryan gasped, struggling to push himself upright. "I'm done." Greg glanced back, his face twisting in frustration. "Fine. Stay here if you're useless." Paul hesitated, his gaze flicking between Ryan and Greg. "We can't just leave him." "We don't have time for this," Greg snapped, grabbing Paul's arm and yanking him toward the fence. Ryan looked up as the two disappeared through the gap, his chest heaving as panic set in. His gaze turned toward Nia, who was now just a few steps away, her movements steady and deliberate. "Stay back!" he shouted weakly, scrambling to his feet. His legs wobbled, and his arms lifted shakily into a defensive stance. Nia stopped just out of reach, her expression cold and unflinching. She could see the fear in his eyes, the way his trembling hands betrayed his bravado. "Don't do this," she said evenly. "You're not going to win." Ryan's breath came in short gasps, his fists tightening feebly. "You don't scare me," he bluffed, though his voice lacked conviction. Nia stepped closer, her movements calm and precise. "I'm giving you a chance to stop before you get hurt again," she said, her tone unwavering. "Take it." Ryan hesitated for a moment, his arms dropping slightly as doubt crept in, but with a sudden, desperate burst, he swung at her. Nia moved effortlessly, sidestepping his attack and grabbing his wrist. With one fluid motion, she twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him to the ground. Ryan let out a yelp of pain, his resistance collapsing under her strength. Pinned to the pavement, he groaned, his voice shaking. Okay. Stop. I give up." Nia kept him restrained, her grip firm as she leaned down. "You didn't need to fight," she said quietly, her voice like ice. "But you made your choice." Ryan didn't respond, his face pressed against the cold pavement as he gasped for air. Nia scanned the lot briefly before reaching for her phone. With Ryan pinned firmly to the ground, Nia reached for her phone, her movements calm and deliberate. Her voice was steady as she spoke to the dispatcher. "This is Nia Taylor. I have a suspect detained at a back lot near 5th and Carter Street. He's involved in an attempted robbery and assault. Send officers immediately." Ryan groaned beneath her, his voice muffled against the pavement. "You don't have to do this," he muttered weakly. Nia ignored him, her sharp gaze scanning the area. She spotted an old metal railing nearby, its rusted surface still solid enough to serve her purpose. Keeping one hand firmly on Ryan, she pulled a length of paracord from her gym bag, a habit ingrained from years of training. Ryan struggled weakly as she hauled him toward the railing. "What are you doing?" he whined, his voice tinged with panic. "Making sure you stay put," Nia replied curtly. She secured his wrists behind his back with a practiced efficiency, tying him to the railing. Ryan squirmed, testing the bindings, but his efforts were futile. "Come on," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I already gave up. Just let me go." Nia crouched in front of him, her expression icy. "You don't get to dictate how this ends. You're lucky I don't have time to deal with you properly. The police will." Ryan's shoulders sagged as he slumped against the railing, his face a mixture of defeat and fear. Satisfied that he wouldn't be going anywhere, Nia stood and adjusted the strap of her gym bag. Her gaze shifted to the gap in the fence where Greg and Paul had fled. They were still out there, and she wasn't letting them escape. "You made your choices," she said coldly, glancing back at Ryan one last time. "Now you'll deal with the consequences." Without another word, she turned and sprinted through the gap in the fence, her focus sharpening as she picked up their trail. The faint sound of distant footsteps and muffled voices reached her ears, spurring her onward. Greg and Paul might have thought they'd gotten away. But Nia wasn't done yet. The hunt continued, and she was closing in. Nia moved swiftly through the gap in the fence, her eyes scanning the dimly lit alley ahead. The sounds of Greg and Paul's hurried movements echoed faintly, guiding her steps as she closed the distance. The city seemed quieter here, the hum of distant traffic muffled by the tall buildings on either side. She paused briefly at the next intersection, crouching low to examine the scuff marks on the pavement. The faint signs of their passage, the erratic direction of footprints, a kicked-over trash can, told her they were losing composure. They were running blind, and that worked in her favor. Ahead, Greg and Paul stumbled into a narrow alleyway, their steps uneven as they glanced back nervously. "She's not going to stop," Paul muttered, his voice strained. "I told you we should have split up." Greg shot him a glare, his breathing labored, but his anger unshaken. "You think that would have helped? She's playing games with us. We stick together and we'll figure something out." Paul hesitated, his face pale with fear. "You don't get it, Greg. She's not normal. She's—" "Enough!" Greg snapped, grabbing Paul's arm. "Just keep moving. We'll lose her." Behind them, Nia stepped lightly over the uneven ground, her movements silent and calculated. She had closed the gap significantly, her sharp eyes catching glimpses of their shadows as they turned another corner. "Running won't help," she called out, her voice cutting through the narrow space like a blade. Greg froze momentarily at the sound of her voice, his grip on Paul tightening. He turned toward the source, his face twisting in frustration. "You want to scare us? It's not working!" Paul pulled at his arm. "Let's go! We can't just stand here!" But Nia was already moving, closing in with deliberate speed. Greg cursed under his breath and shoved Paul forward. They darted down another alley, but their movements were more erratic now, their panic evident. Nia followed at a steady pace, her breathing even. She could hear them just ahead, their frantic steps punctuated by Greg's angry commands and Paul's shaky protests. The narrow alley opened into a small courtyard surrounded by tall brick walls. Greg stopped abruptly, his eyes darting around for an escape route. "We can climb," he muttered, gesturing to a rusted fire escape on the far wall. Paul hesitated, his hands trembling as he glanced at the ladder. I don't think I can make it." "You don't have a choice," Greg snapped, grabbing him by the arm and dragging him toward the wall. Nia stepped into the courtyard just as Greg placed a foot on the ladder. Her presence froze them in place, her expression calm but unyielding. "This is over," she said evenly, her voice carrying an air of finality. Greg's face twisted with anger as he released the ladder and turned to face her. Paul took a step back, his wide eyes darting between Greg and Nia. Nia's sharp gaze locked on Greg and Paul as they froze, their panic momentarily paralyzing them. The rusted fire escape behind them loomed like a final, unreachable lifeline. Greg's jaw clenched as he stepped forward, positioning himself between Nia and Paul. "Stay back!" he barked, his voice filled with false bravado. "You think you're tough? You're nothing." Nia didn't respond. Her measured steps brought her closer, her calm demeanor rattling them more than any words could. Paul's breathing quickened, his fear evident as he shuffled backward. "Greg, we need to go!" he hissed, tugging at his friend's sleeve. "Then go!" Greg snapped, his eyes flicking between Nia and the courtyard's exits. "You're slowing me down anyway." Paul's face twisted with shock. "You're just gonna leave me?" Before Greg could reply, Nia surged forward, her movements a blur of precision and speed. She targeted Paul, her calculated instincts recognizing him as the weaker link. With a well-timed leap, she tackled him to the ground, her weight driving the air from his lungs. Paul let out a choked gasp, flailing beneath her grip. "Get her off me!" he shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. Greg's face paled as he took a step back, his resolve crumbling. His hands balled into fists, but his feet betrayed him, inching toward the alley's exit. "You're on your own," he muttered, his voice shaky. "What?" Paul screeched, his struggles intensifying as he turned toward Greg. "Don't leave me!" But Greg had already bolted, his footsteps pounding against the pavement as he disappeared into the shadows. Nia didn't spare him a second glance. Her focus remained on Paul, who writhed beneath her, his movements growing more frantic. "You're not getting away," she said coldly, her voice steady as she tightened her grip. Paul swung weakly, his fists barely connecting. "Let me go!" he shouted, his voice laced with panic. Nia intercepted his next swing, twisting his arm behind his back and forcing him to the ground. Paul let out a cry of pain, his resistance faltering as she pinned him. "Stop struggling," Nia commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It's over," Paul groaned, his cheek pressed against the cold pavement. "You're crazy," he muttered weakly, his voice muffled. "You'll be thinking about that when the police get here," Nia replied curtly, adjusting her hold to ensure he couldn't move. The sound of Greg's retreat faded into the distance, leaving the courtyard silent except for Paul's ragged breathing. Nia straightened slightly, her grip still firm, her mind already turning to the next step. Greg might have escaped, but he wasn't gone for good, not if she could help it. Nia pulled out her phone, her free hand keeping Paul firmly pinned to the ground. Her breath was steady despite the exertion, but fatigue was beginning to creep into her muscles. The chase, the fights. She had pushed herself to the limit. She dialed quickly, her voice calm but sharp when the dispatcher answered. "This is Nia Taylor. I've detained another suspect involved in an attempted robbery and assault. I'm at a small courtyard off 8th and Marshall. Send officers now." Paul groaned beneath her, his cheek pressed against the pavement. "You think this is going to change anything?" he muttered, his voice filled with resentment. "You're just wasting your time." Nia glanced down at him, her expression cold. "You're lucky I don't have the energy to deal with you the way you deserve." Paul laughed bitterly, his tone mocking. "Oh, big talk. What are you, some wannabe hero? You think you're better than me? I don't think," Nia replied curtly. "I know." Paul's face twisted with anger as he struggled weakly beneath her. "You're nothing," he spat, his voice venomous. "You're just some stuck-up woman who thinks she's tough. But guess what? Nobody cares. You think those cops will do anything? They won't. They'll pat you on the back and let Greg walk." Nia's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she adjusted her grip on his arm, ensuring he couldn't wriggle free. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" she said finally, her tone like ice. "You talk big for someone lying face down in the dirt," Paul sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You got lucky, that's all. Greg's the smart one. He's gone, and you'll never find him. People like you don't win. You're just a speed bump, nothing more." Nia leaned in slightly, her voice low and cutting. "You think running makes him smart? All it does is delay the inevitable. And people like you, you're the reason I won't stop. Not until every last one of you is where you belong." Paul glared at her, but said nothing, his mouth tightening into a thin line. Moments later, the faint sound of sirens broke the tension. Nia straightened slightly, keeping Paul restrained as the noise grew louder. "You can say whatever you want," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But you're done. And Greg? He's next." Paul's shoulders slumped, his fight finally leaving him as the flashing lights of a police car illuminated the courtyard. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruiser illuminated the courtyard as it pulled to a stop. The siren cut off, leaving the faint hum of the engine. Two officers stepped out, their faces calm but cautious as they approached. Nia stood at the center of the courtyard, her body aching with exhaustion. Her ribs throbbed where Paul had landed a punch earlier, and the scrape on her arm still stung, leaving a faint smear of blood on her skin. Despite the pain, she held herself upright, her gaze sharp and unwavering. One officer, a tall man with a graying mustache, approached her directly. "You called this in?" "Yes," Nia replied, her voice steady but tinged with fatigue. "That's the second one I caught." She gestured to Paul, who sat cuffed against a rusted railing, glaring at her with a mix of fear and anger. "The other one, Ryan, was tied up further down the alley. Your team already took him in earlier." The officer nodded, his expression thoughtful. "So that just leaves one, Greg, right?" Nia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, he ran when I tackled this one. He's the leader, and he's dangerous. You need to find him before he hurts someone else." The second officer, a younger woman, crouched to inspect Paul's cuffs. "Looks like you've been through a lot tonight," she said, glancing up at Nia. "You okay? That's a nasty bruise on your cheek." "I'm fine," Nia replied curtly, though the dull ache in her ribs and the burn in her legs begged to differ. "The priority is Greg," Paul chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "Greg's too smart for you. He's long gone." Nia's gaze snapped to him, cold and cutting. "If he's so smart, why are you here? He left you behind, didn't he?" Paul's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Doesn't matter. You won't catch him. The cops won't either. They don't care enough." The older officer sighed, pulling out a notepad. "We'll need your statement," he said to Nia, his tone professional but not dismissive. "Every detail helps." Nia nodded, moving slowly toward a nearby bench. Her legs felt like lead, and her ribs protested every movement as she lowered herself onto the worn wood. "Fine," she said quietly. As she recounted the night's events, the officers listened intently, jotting down every detail. She described Greg's arrogance, Paul's desperation, and Ryan's hesitance, ensuring no nuance was left out. Paul sat silently now, his earlier bravado fading as Nia's account painted a clear picture of their actions. "You've done more than most people would," the younger officer remarked when Nia finished. "But you look like you're in bad shape. Are you sure you're okay?" Nia nodded, though her voice carried a note of weariness. "I'll live. Just find Greg. He's the one you need to worry about." "We'll put out an alert," the older officer assured her. "With Ryan and Paul in custody, we'll have more to work with. But these things take time." Nia's jaw tightened, though she forced herself to relax. The night had taken its toll, but her determination hadn't wavered. "Make sure you do your job," she said evenly, "because if you don't, I will." The officers exchanged a glance before securing Paul in the cruiser and heading back to their vehicle. As the sound of the car faded into the distance, Nia leaned back against the bench, her head resting against the cool brick wall behind her. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind remained fixed on Greg. He might have gotten away tonight, but this wasn't over. Not until he faced justice. The quiet courtyard settled into an uneasy stillness as the police cruiser disappeared into the night. Nia sat on the bench, her back resting against the cool brick wall. Every ache in her body seemed sharper now that the adrenaline had worn off. Her ribs throbbed with every breath, her cheek stung where Greg had struck her, and her scraped arm bore a faint smear of blood. Her sharp gaze moved to the alley where Greg had fled. He was still out there, but rushing into another chase wouldn't guarantee results. The police had Ryan and Paul in custody. They might not have cared enough to go after Greg aggressively, but she could use the two she'd caught to force their hand. Her thoughts shifted to the brief exchanges she'd had with Paul and Ryan. Both had cracked under pressure before, Ryan with his panicked attempts at surrender, and Paul with his desperate bravado. Greg might have thought he could outrun her, but his so-called allies could lead her right to him. She pushed herself off the bench, wincing as her ribs protested the movement. Her body begged for rest, but her resolve refused to falter. She adjusted the strap of her gym bag, reaching for her phone to call the precinct. The officer who had taken her statement answered, his voice gruff. "Taylor, what's the update?" "I want to help," Nia said firmly, pacing the courtyard as she spoke. "You have Ryan and Paul. I need access to them. They know where Greg is hiding." The officer sighed. "We're already questioning them. But these guys don't crack easily. They'll lawyer up or spin lies to waste our time." "Then let me try," Nia pressed. Her tone carried the weight of her exhaustion, but also her determination. "I faced them directly. They're scared of me, scared enough to slip up. Let me talk to them." There was a pause, the faint sound of papers shuffling on the other end. "You're not a cop," the officer said finally. "This isn't standard procedure." "Neither was tonight," Nia shot back. "You know I'm right. I can get through to them faster than you can. Just give me the chance." Another pause, longer this time. When the officer spoke again, his voice carried a note of reluctant agreement. "Fine. We've got them in holding. But you're coming here on our terms. You pushed too hard, and this is over." "I'll be there in 15, Nia said before hanging up. Her body protested with every step as she left the courtyard, but her mind was already working through how she would handle the interrogations. Ryan's nervousness would make him the easier target. He'd crack with the right push. Paul, on the other hand, would need more work. His bravado was a shield, but it wouldn't hold up forever. This wasn't just about catching Greg anymore. It was about showing him, and men like him, that they couldn't keep getting away with this. The precinct was quieter than Nia had expected when she walked through the glass doors. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the distant sound of phones ringing created a backdrop for the subdued activity. Officers moved between desks, some typing reports, others quietly discussing cases. Nia's sharp gaze swept the room as she approached the front desk. The same officer who had processed her statement earlier looked up, his tired expression softening slightly in recognition. "Taylor," he said, standing. "They're both in holding. You sure about this?" "Positive," Nia replied firmly. She adjusted the strap of her gym bag, the ache in her ribs a constant reminder of the night's events. "Let's get this done." The officer nodded, motioning for her to follow him. He led her through a series of hallways, their sterile walls lined with bulletin boards and faded posters. They stopped outside a holding room, where a one-way window offered a view of Ryan sitting at a table, his hands fidgeting nervously. "This one's already cracking," the officer said quietly, gesturing to Ryan. "He's scared out of his mind." Nia nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'll start with him." The officer opened the door, and Nia stepped inside, her presence immediately drawing Ryan's attention. His wide eyes darted toward her, his face pale. "You," he said, his voice shaking. "What are you doing here?" Nia didn't answer right away. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with his visible panic. "You know why I'm here," she said evenly, folding her arms on the table. "You're going to tell me where Greg is." Ryan shook his head quickly, his hands trembling. I don't know. I swear, I don't know." Nia leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but firm. "You've already lied to me once tonight, Ryan. Don't make it worse for yourself. You think Greg cares about you? He ran. He left you to face this alone." Ryan's mouth opened, but no words came out. His gaze dropped to the table, his shoulders slumping. "You're scared," Nia continued, her tone softening slightly. "And you should be. Greg doesn't care what happens to you. But you have a chance to make this easier for yourself. Tell me what I need to know." Ryan hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He has a place," he stammered finally. "I don't know where, exactly. But Paul might. Greg trusts him more." Nia's eyes narrowed. "What else? Does he have a pattern? Somewhere he likes to go? Ryan swallowed hard. Sometimes he talks about the old garages by the docks, says they're perfect for laying low. But I don't know if he's there now. I swear. Nia studied him for a moment, then stood abruptly. Stay here, she said coldly, heading for the door. The officer met her in the hallway, his brow raised. Anything useful? He mentioned the docks. Greg might be hiding there, Nia replied. Her tone was even, but her frustration simmered beneath the surface. And Paul? The officer asked, gesturing toward the adjacent room where Paul sat, his posture defiant even through the one-way window. I'll handle him next, Nia said, her jaw tightening. He'll talk, the officer nodded, unlocking the next door. Nia squared her shoulders, the ache in her body forgotten as she prepared to face Paul. Nia stepped into the next holding room, the door clicking shut behind her. The room was dimly lit, its plain walls and single table doing little to soften the tension. Paul sat in the chair, his arms crossed and his face set in a scowl. His bruises from the fight were visible, his swollen jaw and a faint cut on his forehead. But his defiance remained intact. Well, look who decided to visit, Paul sneered, his voice laced with mockery. What? You're not tired of playing hero yet? Nia didn't react to his taunt. She pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down, her expression cold and unyielding. For a moment she said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. Paul shifted uncomfortably, his smirk faltering slightly. What's this supposed to be? You think you're gonna scare me into talking? Nia's gaze bore into him, her voice calm but cutting. Scare you? No, Paul. I don't need to scare you. You're already afraid. You just won't admit it. Paul laughed harshly, leaning back in his chair. Afraid of you? Please. You got lucky, that's all. Greg's out there, and you're sitting here wasting your time. Greg, Nia said flatly, leaning forward slightly. The same Greg who left you behind without a second thought? The same Greg who ran while you were getting pinned to the ground? Paul's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. You keep acting like he cares about you, Nia continued, her tone growing sharper. But the truth is, he used you. He used all of you. And now he's out there, hiding, while you're sitting here about to take the fall for everything. Paul's hands gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white. You don't know what you're talking about, he muttered. Don't I? Nia shot back, her voice rising slightly. I've seen men like Greg before. Cowards who manipulate people like you into doing their dirty work. He let you fight for him, let you bleed for him. And the second it got hard, he ran. Paul's breathing quickened, his bravado cracking. You don't get it, he said, his voice shaking slightly. Greg's smarter than you think. He always has a plan. Plans don't mean anything if you're too scared to see them through, Nia said, her tone cold. You're the one here, Paul. Not Greg. You're the one facing charges, and the only way you're walking out of here with anything less than the maximum is if you start talking. Paul's eyes darted toward the door, as if he were searching for an escape. I don't know where he is, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Nia slammed her hand on the table, making him flinch. Stop lying, she snapped. You know exactly where he is. You've been covering for him this whole time. But where's he now? Not here. Not helping you. You owe him nothing. Paul glared at her, but his defiance was slipping. You think you're so tough, he muttered bitterly. You don't know what it's like to be used. To be discarded? Nia interrupted, her voice like steel. You think that makes you special? Greg doesn't care about you, Paul. You're a pawn, and right now, you're a pawn who's about to get crushed unless you start cooperating. Paul's hands trembled, his anger giving way to uncertainty. He looked away, his jaw tightening. He mentioned the docks, he muttered finally. Said it was a good place to lay low. Nia leaned back slightly, her gaze still sharp. Anything else? Don't hold back now, Paul. This is your chance to prove you're more than just a follower. Paul hesitated, then sighed heavily. There's a garage near the East End. He talked about it before. Said no one goes there anymore. If he's hiding, That's where he'll be. Nia stood, her voice calm but firm. Good. For your sake, I hope you're telling the truth. She turned and walked to the door, pausing briefly to look back at him. Greg left you behind, Paul. Remember that. Paul didn't respond, his head dropping into his hands as the door clicked shut behind her. The corridor outside was dim and quiet, her footsteps echoing faintly as she walked toward the main precinct area. Her body ached with every step, but the steady rhythm of her breathing kept her focused. The officer from earlier was waiting for her at the desk, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up as she approached, his brow furrowed with concern. How'd it go? He cracked, Nia said simply, leaning against the edge of the desk. Greg's hiding at a garage near the docks. East End, according to Paul. The officer set the coffee down, his expression thoughtful. It's something. Docks aren't exactly a friendly neighborhood, though. You sure about this lead? I am, Nia replied, her tone resolute. Paul didn't have much fight left in him. He was too broken to lie convincingly. The officer nodded, pulling out a map of the area and spreading it across the desk. There are a few garages down there, he said, tracing his finger along the docks. Most are abandoned, but a couple still get used for storage. If Greg's holed up in one of these, it'll be a needle in a haystack unless we move quickly. Nia's eyes scanned the map, her sharp focus zeroing in on the easternmost section. That's where we start, she said firmly. Greg's smart, but he's also predictable. If Paul mentioned the East End specifically, that's our best bet. The officer hesitated, then gave a small nod. I'll call it in. We'll put together a team to check it out. No, Nia said abruptly, her voice steady but insistent. No team. Greg's already running scared, but if he sees a whole squad coming, he'll bolt again. I'll go in first. You back me up once I have him cornered. The officer frowned, his expression skeptical. You've already done more than enough tonight. You're bruised, battered. You really think you're up for this? I don't think, Nia replied, her tone unyielding. I know. Greg's the kind of person who needs to be stopped, and I'm not going to let him slip away because I took a break. The officer sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, he conceded reluctantly. But you're not going in completely alone. I'll have a car nearby, ready to move in when you give the signal. That's all I need, Nia said, pushing off the desk. Her movements were slower now, her body clearly feeling the toll of the night's events, but her determination remained undimmed. As the officer began radioing in support, Nia stepped away, pulling out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts and paused briefly before dialing a number. Hey, she said when the line connected. Her voice was softer now, almost reflective. I just wanted to let you know. I'm okay. It's been a long night, but I'm handling it. The voice on the other end spoke briefly, concern evident even from a distance. I will, Nia replied, nodding even though they couldn't see her. This isn't over yet, but I'm close. I'll call you when it's done. She ended the call, tucking her phone back into her pocket as the officer approached again. Backup's in place, he said. When you're ready, we'll move out. Nia nodded, her sharp gaze locking onto the map one last time. Let's finish this. The faint hum of the car engine faded as Nia stepped out onto the uneven pavement near the docks. The air was heavy with the scent of salt water and rust, and the faint creak of distant boats bobbing against their moorings added an eerie undertone to the quiet night. Shadows stretched long under the flickering streetlights, casting jagged patterns across the crumbling warehouses and abandoned garages that lined the area. Nia adjusted the strap of her gym bag, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. Every detail mattered now. The subtle creak of metal in the breeze, the faint scuff marks on the ground that could indicate recent activity. She crouched low, her fingers brushing against a fresh set of footprints in the dirt. They were uneven, as if someone had been running. Greg. She followed the faint trail, her steps silent against the cracked pavement. The officer's cruiser idled quietly several blocks back, out of sight, but close enough to respond if needed. Nia had insisted on going ahead alone. A heavy police presence would only spook Greg and drive him deeper into hiding. The garages near the East End loomed ahead, their faded paint and rusted shutters a testament to years of neglect. Nia slowed as she approached the first one, her senses on high alert. The faintest hint of movement caught her attention, a shadow shifting behind one of the cracked windows. Her breath slowed as she pressed herself against the wall of the garage, peering inside through the broken pane. The interior was dimly lit, but she could make out stacks of boxes and scattered tools. In the corner, a figure paced back and forth, his movements sharp and agitated. Greg. Nia's jaw tightened as she watched him. He was muttering to himself, his gestures erratic. A heavy wrench lay on the workbench nearby, its metallic glint catching the faint light. She didn't need to hear his words to know he was panicking, trying to figure out his next move. Carefully, she stepped away from the window, moving toward the side entrance. The door was slightly ajar, and she crouched beside it, listening for any other signs of life inside. There was no sound beyond Greg's pacing. He was alone. Her phone buzzed faintly in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from the officer. "We're in position. Signal when you're ready." Nia typed a quick reply. "Target confirmed. Stand by." She slipped the phone back into her pocket, her focus sharpening. Her body still ached from earlier, every movement a reminder of the fights she had endured, but she pushed the pain aside. This was it, the final stretch. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted her stance and prepared to move. The cool night air clung to Nia's skin as she crouched beside the slightly ajar door. Every muscle in her body was taut with anticipation, her sharp gaze locked on the faint light spilling from the cracked garage door. Inside, Greg's pacing continued, his muttered curses occasionally audible over the creak of rusted hinges and the distant echo of waves lapping at the docks. Nia pressed her back against the wall, her breathing slow and deliberate. She adjusted her stance, leaning closer to the door to get a clearer sense of Greg's position. His movements were erratic, the rhythm of his steps broken by occasional pauses as he muttered to himself. "You think you're smart," Greg said suddenly, his voice low but tinged with anger. "Catching those idiots doesn't mean a thing. You'll never get me." Nia's jaw tightened. His arrogance hadn't faded, but she could hear the edge of desperation in his tone. He was trying to convince himself as much as he was muttering into the empty space. Carefully, Nia pushed the door open a fraction wider, her movements silent. The faint creak of the hinges made her pause, but Greg didn't seem to notice. He was too absorbed in his own thoughts, pacing near a stack of crates in the center of the room. The interior of the garage was cluttered. Old tools, broken machinery, and stacks of forgotten parts littered the floor. A single flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, uneven shadows that danced with Greg's movements. The wrench on the workbench caught her attention again, its placement too deliberate. He'd kept it within reach, a fallback weapon if he needed it. Nia slipped through the door, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes flicked to every corner of the room, ensuring there were no surprises waiting. The air inside was heavy, carrying the faint scent of oil and mildew. Greg froze suddenly, his back to her, his head snapping up as if he'd sensed something. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice sharp. Nia didn't respond. She stepped closer, her steps calculated, her breathing steady. Greg spun around, his eyes widening briefly before narrowing into a glare. "You," he hissed, his tone a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Nia stopped a few feet away, her stance steady, her eyes locked on him. "You've been running all night," she said evenly, her voice calm but firm. "It's over, Greg." Greg's hand twitched toward the wrench, his jaw tightening. "You think you're better than me? You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Nia replied. "I know you left your friends behind to take the fall. I know you're out of moves." Greg's glare deepened, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I've got moves you can't even imagine," he snapped, stepping toward the workbench. His fingers brushed against the wrench, and he lifted it with a sharp motion. Nia didn't flinch, her posture remaining steady. "Another bad choice," she said coldly. "You've already lost. Don't make this worse." Greg laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the empty space. "You think I'm afraid of you?" "No," Nia said, taking a measured step forward. "But you should be." The tension in the air crackled as they squared off, the room filled with nothing but the sound of their breathing and the faint hum of the flickering bulb. Greg's grip on the wrench tightened, and Nia shifted her weight, ready for whatever came next. Greg's grip tightened around the wrench, the veins in his hand standing out as he sized up Nia. His eyes burned with anger, but beneath the bravado, there was a flicker of unease. The garage's flickering bulb cast harsh shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. "You really think you're going to walk out of here?" Greg sneered, his voice low and sharp. "After everything you've done?" Nia's expression was cold and unwavering. "Everything I've done?" she replied, her voice calm but cutting. "You chased me, harassed me, tried to rob me, and now I'm the problem?" Greg's lip curled into a bitter smile. "You should have just kept your mouth shut and moved on. You brought this on yourself." Before Nia could reply, Greg lunged, swinging the wrench in a wide arc. The metallic whistle of the weapon cutting through the air filled the space. But Nia was faster. She ducked low, pivoting on her heel as the wrench sailed past her head. Using his overextension to her advantage, she drove her shoulder into his midsection, sending him stumbling back into a stack of crates. The wood groaned under his weight, but Greg quickly regained his footing, his glare more furious than ever. He rushed at her again, feinting to the left, before bringing the wrench down in a brutal overhead swing. Nia sidestepped, her movements fluid, but the wrench grazed her arm, sending a sharp sting radiating up to her shoulder. "You're quick," Greg growled, swinging again, this time aiming for her ribs. "But you're not as tough as you think." Nia blocked the strike with her forearm, the impact reverberating painfully through her bones. She grimaced, but held her ground, countering with a sharp jab to Greg's jaw. The force of the punch sent his head snapping to the side, but he retaliated immediately, slamming the wrench into a nearby crate to throw her off balance. "You think you're better than me?" Greg spat, his voice dripping with venom as he circled her. "Walking around like you own the place, acting like you're untouchable." Nia kept her stance steady, her breathing controlled despite the ache in her side. "Untouchable?" she shot back, her voice steady but rising with anger. "I'm tired of men like you thinking you have the right to touch, to control, to take without consequences." Greg let out a bitter laugh and charged again, swinging the wrench wildly. Nia ducked under the first strike, then spun around to dodge the second. She delivered a precise kick to his knee, sending him crashing to the ground with a grunt of pain. But he didn't stay down. Snarling, Greg grabbed a nearby pipe and used it to pull himself upright. He jabbed the pipe toward her in quick, aggressive bursts, forcing Nia to step back. On the fourth thrust, she caught the pipe with both hands, twisting it sharply to disarm him. "You don't know what it's like," Greg shouted, his face red with exertion and fury. "People like me, we're the ones always getting blamed, always getting punished." "Blamed?" Nia shot back, her grip on the pipe tightening as she threw it aside. "You attacked me because I didn't give you what you wanted. And now you want to play the victim?" Greg roared in frustration and swung a punch at her, his bare fists now his only weapon. Nia blocked the blow with her forearm, countering with a quick uppercut that sent him staggering back. She followed with a sweeping kick to his legs, knocking him off balance. "You don't like being called out," she said, her voice laced with fury. "You don't like being told no. Men like you think the world owes you, that you can say and do whatever you want without consequences." Greg scrambled back to his feet, his chest heaving. He feinted to the left, then lunged at her, tackling her into a stack of crates. The wood splintered under their combined weight, and the impact sent a jolt of pain through Nia's already bruised ribs. She gritted her teeth, twisting beneath him and driving her elbow into his side. Greg cried out, loosening his grip just enough for her to roll free. She sprang to her feet, ignoring the throb in her ribs, and squared off with him again. "You think this is about you," she continued, her voice shaking with anger. "Your ego, your power, your need to dominate, but it's not. This is about every woman who's had to deal with your kind of filth." Greg's eyes widened in rage, and he charged again, throwing wild punches. Nia ducked and weaved, her movements precise as she let him exhaust himself. When he overextended on a particularly sloppy swing, she stepped in and drove her knee into his stomach. Greg collapsed to the ground, coughing and gasping for air. He tried to crawl toward the wrench, but Nia stepped on his hand, pinning it to the floor. "Don't!" she said coldly. Greg glared up at her, his defiance flickering. "This doesn't change anything," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "You think you've won? You're just another loudmouth trying to take what isn't yours." Nia crouched down, her face inches from his. "What isn't mine?" she said, her voice low and deadly. "My safety? My dignity? My humanity? Those things were never yours to take." Greg didn't respond, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to catch his breath. Nia pulled out her phone, her fingers steady as she dialed. "This is Nia Taylor," she said, when the dispatcher answered. "I have the final suspect detained at the docks. Send backup." Greg slumped back against the ground, his breathing shallow as his fight drained away. Nia straightened, her body aching but her resolve unbroken. This was over, at least for him. The faint sound of sirens grew louder, their wailing echoing across the quiet docks. Nia stood over Greg, her chest rising and falling steadily as she kept her eyes locked on him. He lay sprawled on the floor, his hand clutching his side where her knee had driven the air out of him. The defiance in his eyes flickered, replaced by a growing realization that his time had run out. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the garage as a police cruiser pulled up outside. Two officers stepped out, their footsteps brisk and purposeful as they approached the open door. One was the older officer Nia had spoken with earlier. His sharp gaze immediately swept the scene. "Nia!" he called out, his voice calm but firm. "You okay?" Nia straightened slightly, wincing as the ache in her ribs reminded her of the night's toll. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady. "He's the last one." The officer nodded, stepping inside with his partner. Their boots scuffed against the concrete as they moved toward Greg, who was still slumped against the wall. He scowled as they approached, his chest heaving with labored breaths. "Stay where you are," the older officer ordered, his hand hovering near his holster. Greg glared up at them, his lip curling. "What took you so long?" he muttered bitterly. "Your hero here already had her fun." The younger officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs, her expression stoic. "You're under arrest," she said flatly, "for attempted robbery, assault, and resisting arrest. You have the right to remain silent." "Oh, spare me the speech," Greg snapped, attempting to push himself up. The older officer stepped forward, his tone firm. "Stay down." Greg froze, his jaw tightening. Nia watched as his bravado crumbled further under the weight of their presence. "Let's make this easy," the younger officer said, grabbing his arm and pulling it behind his back. The metallic click of the cuffs echoed in the garage as she secured his wrists. As Greg was hauled to his feet, he glanced back at Nia, his eyes filled with bitterness. "This isn't over," he spat. "You think you're some kind of savior? You're nothing." Nia didn't flinch, her expression unyielding. "You're right," she said evenly. "I'm not a savior. I'm just someone who didn't let you win." Greg's scowl deepened, but he didn't reply as the officers led him toward the cruiser. The older officer paused beside Nia, his gaze softening slightly. "You did good," he said quietly. "I did what I had to," Nia replied, her voice calm but tired. She adjusted the strap of her gym bag, feeling the weight of the night settling into her bones. The officer nodded. "Get some rest. We'll handle the rest from here." Nia watched as the officers loaded Greg into the back of the cruiser, his glare still burning through the window as they closed the door. The sound of the engine starting broke the silence, and the car pulled away, its lights fading into the distance. For the first time that night, Nia allowed herself a moment to exhale deeply. Her body ached. Her mind was exhausted, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing Greg was no longer a threat. The docks were silent again, save for the faint lapping of water against the pier. Nia turned and walked toward the empty street, her steps steady, despite the weariness that tugged at her. Tonight, she had fought, endured, and won. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had been made to feel powerless. The weeks following Greg's arrest were a blur of activity, paperwork, and preparation. Nia sat at her kitchen table, a stack of documents spread out before her. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet room as she flipped through the pages, each one outlining the events of that night in painstaking detail. The prosecutor had been thorough, interviewing her multiple times to ensure they had a clear narrative. Nia appreciated the effort, but reliving the night was exhausting. Every question, every clarification brought back the weight of Greg's sneer, Paul's taunts, and Ryan's panicked pleas. "You're the key witness," the prosecutor had told her during their last meeting. "Your testimony will make or break this case." Nia stared at the file in front of her, her fingers tracing the edge of the page. She had faced worse, physically, emotionally, but the thought of sitting in a courtroom, recounting every moment in front of strangers, still left her uneasy. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was the prosecutor. "Nia!" The woman's voice came through crisp and professional. "I wanted to check in before the trial tomorrow. How are you feeling?" Nia leaned back in her chair, her free hand rubbing her temple. "I'm ready," she said after a moment, her voice steady. "I've gone over everything more times than I can count." "Good," the prosecutor replied. "You've been incredible through this. Just remember, you're not alone in there. Stick to the facts, take your time, and don't let the defense rattle you. They'll try to twist things, but the jury will see through it." Nia nodded, though the prosecutor couldn't see her. "I'll be fine," she said, more to herself than to the woman on the other end of the line. "See you tomorrow, then," the prosecutor said before hanging up. Nia set the phone down and took a deep breath, staring out the window. The evening sky was painted in soft hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She thought of Greg's sneer, Paul's weak excuses, Ryan's fear. She thought of every catcall she had ignored, every moment of tension walking alone at night, every time someone like Greg had tried to make her feel small. Her jaw tightened. Tomorrow, she would face them again, but this time, on her terms. The courtroom buzzed with a subdued energy, the quiet murmur of voices filling the space as people settled into their seats. Nia stood in the hallway outside, her back leaning against the cool, cream-colored wall. Her hands rested on the strap of her bag, gripping it tightly, as if it anchored her. The prosecutor appeared beside her, her crisp navy suit pressed and immaculate. "Nia," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They're ready for us. Are you?" Nia nodded, straightening her posture. "I'm ready." The prosecutor offered a reassuring smile. "You've got this. Just focus on the truth. Let the facts speak for themselves." As they entered the courtroom, Nia's sharp eyes scanned the space. The jury sat in their box, their expressions neutral but attentive. At the defense table, Greg sat flanked by his attorney, his glare as sharp as ever. Paul avoided eye contact, staring down at the polished surface of the table, while Ryan fidgeted, his nervous energy palpable. Nia's heart beat steadily, a rhythm she controlled with practiced precision. Her training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but the weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. This wasn't a battlefield, but it felt no less critical. The judge entered, and the room rose briefly before settling again. The prosecutor began her opening statement, her voice firm and deliberate as she laid out the events of the night. "These three men thought they could intimidate, harass, and harm an innocent woman," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "But they underestimated her. They underestimated justice." Nia listened carefully, her focus unwavering as the prosecutor painted a vivid picture of what had happened. The defense lawyer followed, his tone measured as he attempted to cast doubt on the events, suggesting misunderstandings and exaggerations. Nia's jaw tightened, but she remained composed. When her name was called, she stood, her steps steady as she approached the witness stand. The room seemed to quiet further, the weight of her presence commanding attention. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor began once Nia was sworn in. "Nia Taylor," she replied, her voice firm. "Ms. Taylor," the prosecutor continued, stepping closer to the stand, "can you describe what happened on the night in question?" Nia took a deep breath, her gaze briefly flicking to Greg. His smug expression sent a flicker of anger through her, but she channeled it into clarity. She recounted the events with precision, her voice steady despite the emotions simmering beneath the surface. She described the catcalls, the harassment, the chase, and the fight in vivid detail. Her words were measured but powerful, painting a clear picture of the danger she had faced and the resolve she had shown. The courtroom was silent, except for her voice, each word landing like a strike. When the prosecutor asked her how she felt during the ordeal, Nia paused, her eyes sweeping the room before landing on the jury. "I felt tired," she said finally, her voice calm but resonant. "Tired of men like them, thinking they can say or do whatever they want without consequences. Tired of being treated like less because of the way I look, the color of my skin." A ripple of emotion passed through the jury, and even the defense lawyer shifted uncomfortably. When the prosecutor finished, the defense lawyer stood, buttoning his jacket as he approached the stand. His tone was slick, his words carefully chosen as he began his cross-examination. "You're a trained Navy SEAL, aren't you, Miss Taylor?" he asked, his voice almost casual. "Yes," Nia replied simply. "So, would it be fair to say you have extensive combat training?" "Yes," she said again, her tone steady. The lawyer spread his hands. "Would it also be fair to say that you could have escalated the situation? That your skills might have made the defendants feel threatened?" Nia's gaze didn't waver. "My skills kept me alive. If they felt threatened, it's because they chose to chase me, corner me, and attack me." The lawyer hesitated, his next question faltering as the jury shifted in their seats. The judge called for a brief recess, and Nia stepped down from the stand, her shoulders squared as she walked past Greg and his co-defendants. She caught his glare, but didn't acknowledge it. Her focus was ahead, on justice, on truth. The courtroom settled again as the recess ended, the quiet murmur of voices fading to a tense stillness. The defense lawyer stood, his expression calm but calculating as he prepared to deliver his closing arguments. Greg, Paul, and Ryan sat at the defense table, their body language reflecting their respective states. Greg's simmering defiance, Paul's stoic resignation, and Ryan's nervous fidgeting. The lawyer adjusted his tie before addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and deliberate, "this case is not as clear-cut as the prosecution would have you believe. My clients made poor decisions, yes, but we must examine the circumstances surrounding those decisions." He paced slowly, his hands gesturing with measured confidence. "The events of that night were chaotic. Emotions were high. My clients acted impulsively, without thinking, and they deeply regret their actions. But should that regret be met with the harshest penalties possible? Or should we consider their humanity?" Nia's jaw tightened as she listened. The defense lawyer's words felt like an erasure of the terror she had experienced, a softening of their crimes into mere lapses in judgment. "These are not hardened criminals," the lawyer continued, gesturing toward the defendants. "They are men who made mistakes. Mistakes we've all made at some point in our lives, letting anger or frustration get the better of us." The jury's expressions were unreadable, their gazes shifting between the lawyer and the defendants. The lawyer paused, his tone softening as he addressed them directly. "I ask you to look beyond the surface and consider whether punishment or rehabilitation serves justice better in this case." He returned to his seat, offering Greg a slight nod. Greg smirked, the gesture small but infuriating. The prosecutor rose, her expression sharp and focused. "Mistakes," she began, her voice cutting through the room. "What happened that night was not a mistake. It was a choice, a deliberate series of choices made by these three men to harass, intimidate, and attack Ms. Taylor." She moved closer to the jury, her gaze sweeping over them. "Let's not forget what Ms. Taylor described. The catcalling, the chase, the physical assault, these weren't spur-of-the-moment lapses in judgment. They were calculated acts of aggression. The prosecutor pointed toward the defendants, her voice rising with conviction. These men didn't care about Ms. Taylor's humanity that night. They saw her as a target, a woman they could overpower, demean, and silence. And when she refused to submit, they escalated their violence. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his smirk fading. Ryan's hands trembled slightly, his eyes darting toward the floor. The prosecutor turned back to the jury, her tone softening but retaining its strength. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about accountability. It's about sending a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Not today. Not ever. She returned to her seat, her gaze meeting Nia's briefly. A silent exchange of resolve passed between them before the judge addressed the jury, instructing them to deliberate. The courtroom emptied slowly, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Nia remained seated, her hands resting on her lap as she stared straight ahead. The weight of the trial pressed against her, but she refused to let it crush her resolve. The defendants were led away in cuffs, Greg's glare lingering on her for a moment before the door closed behind him. "You did everything you could," the prosecutor said softly as she approached Nia. Nia nodded, though her mind raced with uncertainty. "Now it's up to them," she replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She stood, straightened her jacket, and walked out of the courtroom into the cool afternoon air. She took a deep breath, the crisp breeze offering a moment of clarity. Whatever the jury decided, she had spoken her truth, and that was something no one could take away from her. The courtroom was packed as the jury filed back in, their faces solemn and unreadable. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the wooden benches amplified in the hushed anticipation. Nia sat toward the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on the foreperson of the jury, but her mind replayed the events of the trial, the testimony, the arguments, and the weight of every word. The judge addressed the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, standing with a sheet of paper in hand. The judge nodded. "Please, read the verdict." The foreperson cleared her throat, her voice steady as she began. "In the case of the State versus Gregory Hall, Paul Foster, and Ryan Pierce, we find the defendants guilty on all charges, including attempted robbery, assault, and aggravated harassment." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom, followed by murmurs that the judge quickly silenced with a sharp rap of the gavel. Nia's heart pounded in her chest, her grip tightening on her hands as she absorbed the words, "Guilty." Greg's jaw clenched, his face twisting in anger as he muttered something under his breath. Paul slumped forward, his head hanging low, while Ryan's shoulders shook, his pale face etched with fear. The judge continued, his tone firm and unwavering. "Given the severity of the crimes and the impact on the victim, sentencing will be as follows. Gregory Hall, as the leader and primary instigator, you are sentenced to 15 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 10. Paul Foster and Ryan Pierce, as accomplices, you are each sentenced to 10 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 7. Nia felt a wave of relief wash over her, though it was tempered by the lingering weight of everything that had led to this moment. Justice had been served, but the scars, both visible and invisible, remained. Greg shot her a venomous glare as he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his defiance still smoldering despite the verdict. Paul followed silently, his movements sluggish, while Ryan glanced back at Nia, his eyes wide with a mix of regret and fear. The prosecutor approached Nia, her expression softening. "It's done," she said quietly. "They'll face the consequences now." Nia nodded, standing slowly. "They thought they could get away with it," she said, her voice steady. "I wasn't going to let that happen." The prosecutor placed a hand on her shoulder briefly before walking away, leaving Nia to gather her thoughts. She lingered in the courtroom for a moment, the gravity of the trial settling over her. Justice had been served, But it wasn't just about her. It was about sending a message that no one was above accountability. As Nia stepped out into the cool afternoon air, a sense of quiet resolve filled her. She had stood her ground, fought for her voice to be heard, and ensured that men like Greg, Paul, and Ryan couldn't continue their cycle of harm. The fight was over, but the impact of what she had done would ripple far beyond the courtroom walls. The sun hung low in the sky as Nia walked along the waterfront, her steps steady despite the ache that lingered in her body. The soft rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant sound of waves lapping against the docks created a sense of calm, a stark contrast to the chaos of the last few weeks. She paused at a bench overlooking the water, resting her hands on the worn wood as she gazed out at the horizon. The trial was over, the verdict delivered, and the men who had tried to harm her were now behind bars. It should have felt like an ending, but to Nia, it felt more like a beginning. Her mind drifted to the faces of the jury as they listened to her testimony, the quiet intensity in their eyes as she recounted the fear, the anger, and the resolve that had carried her through that night. She had spoken not just for herself, but for every woman, every person who had been made to feel small or powerless. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from the prosecutor. "You were incredible today. This verdict will make a difference." Nia allowed herself a small smile, tucking the phone away. The prosecutor was right. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about drawing a line, about showing that the world wouldn't turn a blind eye to actions like Greg's. She thought back to the fight in the garage, the sharp sting of his words, and the fury that had fueled her. Men like Greg had always existed, arrogant, entitled, and dismissive of anyone they deemed weaker. But standing against them had been worth every bruise, every ache. It was a reminder that strength wasn't just physical. It was in the choice to fight back, to not let fear or pain dictate the outcome. A group of children ran past her, their laughter ringing through the air. Nia watched them for a moment, her expression softening. This fight had been hers, but it was also for them, for the world they would grow up in, a world where they could feel safe, valued, and equal. She sank onto the bench, her fingers tracing the rough grain of the wood. The physical wounds would heal, but the deeper scars, both from that night and from countless others like it, would take time, and that was okay. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant growing stronger, wiser, and more determined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Nia felt a quiet sense of pride. She had stood up, fought back, and refused to let injustice win. The path forward might not always be easy, but she knew now that she was capable of walking it. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel hope, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed a reminder that they weren't alone in their fight. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.